Hey, it's 2020 something and there's support out there that didn't get a report out there, by me at least. For that you can blame Legacy of Destruction for taking until the last nanosecond of 2023 to reveal the new Ancient Gears. To be honest, I really thought it was gonna be Arcana Force, but you know Konami, it's always a coin flip with that company. This first video in this edition of the annual trilogy will be focused entirely around the new Earthbounds, because it was only fitting to adapt an out-of-the-blue anime-only offshoot archetype consisting of a dozen cards that had barely anything to do with the originals, gameplay or story-wise, and were used by a Russian bondage enthusiast. But hey, it was either this or the penis deck. Earthbound Prisoner Groundkeeper is a pretty basic swarming tool, at least for the current iteration of the archetype. A tuner special summoning another monster directly from deck is always cool, and in the case of this support wave, the two monsters it gives you access to offer a different set of utility in each case. Neither mind-blowing of course, we are talking about Earthbounds here, but there is a bit of potential for fun plays we'll get to in a minute. The protection effect is nice, at least to stop a bit of interruption, but I'd rather it be on anything that's not supposed to immediately leave the field for an extra deck play. Why did the TCG remove the chain from his neck? His name is not Earthbound Prison Breaker. Next up is the other new tuner, Earthbound Prisoner Line Walker. If they keep going like this, they're gonna have enough walkers to run a pilgrimage on that line. I'm not a fan of searchers that only fetch specific individual cards, but the choice of their new field spell or the crazy Synchro Fusion card is good enough to make it a 3-off. You wouldn't think using one tuner to special summon another would be a great idea, but with any amount of additional field setup, it can actually be a surprisingly strong playmaker. The weird second effect exists only as a reference to the anime for the sake of forcing an interaction with some of their new boss monsters, which you may or may not end up activating every now and then. But besides that, it's a decently versatile card considering that all it does is search one of two spells, and I am definitely not mad that it can't search any Earthbound back row for some reason. Their last new main deck monster is Earthbound Prisoner Stone Sweeper. This is a good card, but I'm a bit torn on it. It's an easy level 5 body on the field, which is nice and something this deck appreciates, and the search effect is great even outside of the archetype such as in stuff like Resonators, but I wish it wasn't a binary choice between the two. Usefulness of the former tends to depend on having access to the latter, but because you can't have both, you're often left praying for a stacked hand. If you can revive it after the discard, it can be a valuable extender, so it definitely has that going for it, but again, it can be tricky to do that without archetypal field building. Fetching it with Groundkeeper is an instant level 6 synchro, making the two cards a cute mini-engine, much like Line Walker in any deck that can utilize their Synchro Fusion spell. Versatility is just about the last thing I expected out of Earthbound, so I have to commend them for that, even though they might be that only by name. Before looking at the extra deck, I think Harmonic Synchro Fusion deserves an early spotlight, because this card was kind of a mythical subject in anime adaptation talk for a while. And why wouldn't it be? I mean, Synchro and Fusion summon at the same time? That's like two things, they can't print that. What's next? Harmonic Ritual Xyz Link? And now that it's out, what's the verdict? It's alright. It's not so much that people overestimated the breadth of utility it would have, which they did, but it's mostly that there are some annoying limitations in place. For one, it locks you into synchros and fusions, which is reasonable but unfortunate for archetypes with colorful exodects like DDDs, Rockets, or Fire Fists, but more importantly, it doesn't treat the summon in question as a fusion or a synchro summon. This means that anything that must first be summoned, or at least gets their effects out that way, is out of the question, which rules out a huge chunk of monsters, including but not limited to Master of Ham. Little hamsters could never have big adventures. Finally, there's the problem of the card just kinda being a worse ultra polymerization in all aspects other than being searchable. This thing properly fusion summons, it can be responded to, and gives you back the materials which you can then proceed to do whatever with, not just synchro summoning. And given that it was printed 6 years earlier, it makes Synchro Fusion come off less like an awesome adaptation of a hyped up anime card and more as quirky pack filler. All that aside, the card is still cool. Obviously, it's very much intended to be used in new Earthbounds, but it is fully generic, making for a fun novelty and potentially some niche usage you never thought about before. Muddy Muddragon and Starving Venom are some decently fun targets for it, I guess. Maybe one day this will somehow be broken, but until then, let's see how Earthbounds make use of it. Their level 6 Fusion and Synchro duo consists of Earthbound Servant Geo Gremlin and Earthbound Servant Geo Gremlina. What a lovely family. Gremlin's targeting effect is kind of pathetic in that it lets the opponent choose to simply not have their monster destroyed at the cost of giving you some very expendable life points. The second effect is much more important here, giving you a Miracle Fusion during the battle phase, which can help with building the field or going in for an OTK. Gremlina's search effect is a nice extender, although I wish it could also search back row. The Synchro direct attack is a good bonus, and the burn damage on destruction goes along with the deck's new shtick. It would be nice if Gremlin could actually reliably destroy something for this to go off, but it's far from the the only way to pop things with Earthbounds. Both of these serve generally as setup tools, and they do a decent enough job at it, but you can't really do much with them without some further field building. So in that regard, we have the level 8 duo, Earthbound Servant Geo Griffin and Earthbound Servant Geo Kraken. Griffin's revival effect is simple but effective extension, essentially letting you climb on summon into any generic level 9 or 11 synchro, which is a huge deal for this deck. The floating is also good to have, as you get some spot removal with potentially beefy burn damage, given all the Earthbounds you went through to make it. The floating is also good to have, as you get some spot removal with potentially beefy burn damage, given all the Earthbounds you went through to make it. Also, the extra presence of synchros in the deck makes Greater Linewalker much easier to summon, cause I know you love seeing big burly men on your field. Geo Kraken's terraforming effect is a bit weird to me, since you'd much rather have a field spell up while you're making all these plays instead of after it, but at least these guys don't blow themselves up without one. Immortal my ass. The second effect is honestly kind of insane given the archetype it's in, forcing the opponent to carefully time their plays and get rid of the card as soon as possible, unless they want to get nuked for a good chunk of damage. It's also super easy to summon, essentially having the same condition as Gremlina within the deck, probably making it the most consistent interruption in the archetype. I'm genuinely surprised that they let you activate this on the opponent's turn, cause it would have been such an easy and predictable kneecap to simply carry over the anime limitation and make the card about 1/5 as good. So yeah, if you want some good Earthbounds on your field, just release the Kraken. Their final boss monster in this lineup is the level 10 Earthbound Servant Geo Grasha. To repeat some of the highest praise I can give to an Earthbound card, it's alright. For one, you're most likely summoning it using Gremlin's Battle Phase effect, so it's not happening on turn 1, but it's not that hard to put it on the field. The attack reduction lets you dispatch anything that's not immune to battle destruction, and the nuke effect has good synergy with their new spot removal. All this makes the ideal Earthbound board a kind of minefield for the opponent, in which they can often be a single play away from a field wipe. Finally, the floating is acceptable, either letting you summon back one of their playmakers, a fusion or a synchro, or even one of the immortals if you have a field spell up. I'll say none of this is mandatory for the deck to function, it's a bit of a win more monster all things considered, but if you're not expending valuable field resources to make it, it's good enough for what it is. Moving on to the back row, we have the quick play Earthbound Fusion. This one's interesting because the fusion effect is actually not specific to the archetype. This gives you a quick polymerization for any dark fusion monster as long as you have a field spell up, making it more versatile both in and out of the archetype, such as in Barrock's Beatdown. The floating effect helps a lot with setup, being able to easily put a large monster on the field and help out with the OTK, as long as you have it in your hand or graveyard. It's also just nice to be able to fusion summon without having to worry about putting 2 Earthbounds on the field for harmonic synchro fusion, so it also works in the form of a hand unbreaker. It's nothing too special, but it's not bad either, so there's definitely a place for it in the deck. Their brand new field spell, Earthbound Prison, is a very welcome addition to the archetype after the clunky travesty that was Geoglyph. This is where they put the guy that made that card. The extra normal summon is fantastic, regardless of the Earthbound variant you're playing, as it can be downright crucial play extension, and it's easily the best part of the card. The rest of it is just kinda funny. Spot negate on activation is such a weird effect for a field spell to have, but it can definitely prevent some pesky interruption, and the life point halving with mass negation on floating is one of the most ridiculous reading checks in the game that basically makes me pray the opponent doesn't look before popping it. I'm not desperate enough to overlay 2 Stone Sweepers for Durandal just to pull it off on command, but it's a fantastic safeguard that will either ensure the card stays on the field or heavily punish the opponent for fucking with it. It helps immensely that it's also searchable within the archetype, so compared to their initial field spell outing, this might as well be Mystic Mine. First of their 2 new traps, Earthbound Release, has a potentially nasty nuke and burn effect, which is completely shot in the foot by the card not being searchable. You could make an argument for running it despite the activation condition, cause plenty of people are still summoning high-level monsters, but it's impossible to get your hands on this without drawing it. Besides, as weird as it feels to say, Earthbounds already have plenty of access to destruction and burn damage without this card. It's another victim in the long line of back row ignored by Geoglyph's stupid Earthbound Immortal disclaimer. Similarly, we have the continuous trap, Earthbound Resonance, and it's more burn damage and destruction. That's fine, but I feel like they're overcorrecting a bit when it comes to this deck's win condition. It's like they're purposely forgetting to supply them with a few more playmakers they actually need. Don't get me wrong, it's cool and even kinda hilarious that Earthbound suddenly have so much damage output and removal, but I don't see why they couldn't have gotten some more main deck monsters over an unsearchable manga card nobody remembers. Point being, don't run it. I'm not talking about Zoma the Earthbound Spirit. I already said leave me alone, Earthbound Spirit. This deck is bad. Now, this is not news, it's basically been the MO of Earthbound since day one. What fascinates me though is all the ways in which it's bad now compared to before, because there's almost something good here this time around. Their main deck monsters are solid for a change, the new bosses are pretty competent, and the back row is potentially pretty useful. However, they're also a brick city that crumbles after one negate and requires copious external engines to work, or it struggles with basic field building. If they weren't constrained by doing anime adaptations, I think they could easily put out a few game original cards that give the archetype some more wind in its sails, or lines in their dirt. On that topic, the teaming on the servants is so nothing. Immortals were very distinctly based around existing Nazca lines, and as contrived as it was in terms of gameplay, the Inca sub-series generally fits them in terms of style and mythology. Servants are random monsters from who gives a shit. We got gremlins, griffins, krakens, and the Ars Goetia equivalent of pack filler. If they weren't on the ground, I don't want them around. I guess my whole point is, I'm glad these aren't garbage, but they're still not good enough for me to care either. See you in part 2.